Hello, my name is Dave Court. I'm an artist from Adelaide, Australia, living and working on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. I have a background in painting and have worked in a lot of different areas in media, from public art, sculpture, mural painting, events, a lot of collaboration with musicians, and recently have been getting more and more into digital processes and making and exploring a lot of generative and live interactive and AI making processes. Today I'm going to give a bit of a lecture and a talk about AI in art and AI literacy, and kind of just walk through ways that I've been using AI in my making processes and talk a bit about that and some thoughts that I have around that. An example of this is some paintings from an exhibition that I held last year. This is what this one is here. But then I think to start off, maybe to give just a general overview, I'll play a little show reel video of some of my previous work. So you can see in the video there are a lot of different types of processes, all with a background in painting, but then exploring with a lot of different things. I guess my real transition and dive into digital art making and going really deep on digital tools happened with COVID. Like, a lot of people spend a lot more time in my house and unable to get to the studio. So I ended up teaching myself tools like Touch Designer and Blender. And then because of these processes, upgraded my PC and then ended up with a more powerful graphics card and having the capability to start experimenting with AI and image generation processes that were a lot more graphics heavy when those things started coming out and becoming freely available. These things kind of started with EQGAN and early image generation tools where it was nowhere near the kind of fidelity that things are today that you might have seen. But it was things like this where it was creating more like abstract and just creating like a feeling and vibe and experimenting with what is able to be done with these tools. A little disclaimer as well about this video. Apologies if it's a bit jumpy. I've been using a AI editing tool called Descript to help me put these kind of videos together. So I'm just going to be, chopping up bits and pieces as it goes. So that's a tool that I'm using for this. And I've also used a bit of GPT-4 to help me write a lecture outline here. So started with early VQGAN tools, and then when DALL-E came out, I was granted an early access to that and used this a lot in an exhibition that I held in 2022. So this was a exhibition of mine where I created a body of work, including paintings, and the concept was making abstract works and then using DALL-E to generate variations of these abstract compositions and then recreate these artificially generated images as real paintings. So it ended up with a series of pairs of paintings like this. So one is purely human made and generated with the gestures and marks. Even though I was using other digital tools, it was not using AI tools to do the making there. And then the other pair on the right hand side is a DALL-E AI model generated composition and shape, which I then retraced, laser cut and painted. So that's a process that I've been kind of using a bit in my painting work that includes AI. And I'll just put in a little snippet of this here, but this is another video work that was included in my 2022 exhibition. This one is a fully Blender rendered 3D composition, so 3D animation using Blender as the engine and the tool there. It is a combination of sculpted objects made in Blender and pieces made in VR Gravity Sketch program. So it was drawing in 3 dimensions and exporting that and using them as elements to build these compositions. And then I created, as a pairing to this, a AI version of this composition. So it was basically a image model trained on previous work of mine. It was a lightly modified stable diffusion or disco diffusion actually model, and then running this video through here to create a similar looking video but with a different feeling and aesthetic to it, which I was kind of interested in. So for the bulk of this lecture, I'll talk through one specific project. This was the Artificial Truth Machine. ATM was a project that I worked on in collaboration with another artist based in Adelaide, James Brown, and collaboration with the Australian Institute for Machine Learning that operates out of the University of Adelaide here. So we received a commission to create a public artwork to exist in public space that used machine learning tools as a part of its processes. Here's a little graphic design logo element that we made for it. And here's the actual machine. So the machine, at the moment, it is situated in Rundle Place, which is a kind of high-end shopping mall area in the CBD of Adelaide, as basically a sculpture for people to come and interact with. So the base of the machine is an old vending machine that you would buy snacks out of, which we purchased secondhand, and then built around it all of these elements and put a computer inside and created sensors, microphone, camera, and screen and buttons and all of these kind of things to add on to make it an interactive artwork that you have a conversation with and it will give you an outcome. So basically you would go up to the machine, push the button that is glowing on the machine, and it will begin an engagement with you. So it will commence a conversation. It has speakers, it talks to an interacting user, and a microphone that listens to you and a camera that watches you. So you talk to the machine, you have a bit of a back and forth. You can ask it anything you want. It's powered by GPT-3, and we've written pre-prompted certain characters and characteristics that are randomized for each day. So there's a set number of characters and it chooses a different character for each day that it comes online. So a person has an interaction with it. It goes back and forth, and then at the end of this conversation, the GPT-3 is asked to synthesize the conversation into a poem, which is presented to the user. And this poem is also used as a text prompt to create a stable diffusion generated artwork that is shown on the screen with a QR code that will take you to a web page where you can download the image that you've made. And then also, if you satisfy certain conditions with your conversation, you get delivered a packet of seeds. These are packets of rare and native seeds, Australian native seeds from a Botanic Gardens seed bank here. They're a little packet of seeds wrapped up in paper, which also has artwork printed on the inside of it. So you get delivered these packet of seeds and you can take it home and plant it and create something new out of it. The idea behind this was to kind of invert the idea of a traditional vending machine. Instead of something that you go to and you exchange currency for sugary snacks, you engage with this machine and you exchange interaction and conversation for artwork and something that you can take away and create something new. So it's kind of creation instead of consumption is the basic idea behind it. On top of that, we've got this world that it lives in around the aesthetic. There's like poetry that we've written in collaboration with GPT-3 that is embossed on the outside. It was working with a whole team of people, of programmers and designers and fabricators to make this whole thing. So this was, early renders of it. We worked with another local artist, James Dodd, who worked a lot on the fabrication and making the metal components. And then we worked with another local contractor to create the cladding for the concrete that would go all around it. And then, lots of different programming components. So a lot of the programming of the machine was done using Touch Designer as the back end. And then we kind of plugged in a few things to that. So this interface was built using Touch Designer and put in some like pre-built animation that I've made in the middle there, and some fonts and graphics from a few different areas. So Touch Designer provides a skeleton for the whole thing and makes all the pieces stick together. So we have basically on the back end you have OpenAI's Whisper model, which listens to the person speaking and converts that to text, which is then sent to GPT-3 via the OpenAI's API. This generates a response, sends it back to the computer inside the machine, and then we have another AI model that converts this text to speech and then sends it out of the speakers to the user. And the other AI component that we have integrated into the machine is a stable diffusion image generation. So we've got a model for stable diffusion that is running locally on the machine, generating the image based on the person's conversation. And I wanted to make this a collaboration between the user and the machine. We've got it operating by starting with seed images. I've put into it a series of starting points that once it receives the text prompt, it uses these seed images as the starting point for what the final artwork will be. And these are actually generated by DALL-E as well. I went through and created a bunch of these that kind of look like they might be plants coming out of the machine, and thinking about this idea of the natural and the computer generated, and what kind of artwork would this seed vending machine want to create if it was working with a human? It has a whole collection of images that it uses as a starting point. Then it adds onto it as well. I've created a little module inside of Touch Designer that will create unique randomizations on top of these starting point images. So as well as selecting from 30 or so starting point seed images, that has these additions added onto it as well. For example, this might be the starting point that is selected, and then this is a little embellishment that happens inside of Touch Designer after a conversation occurs. So what you can see here is an emoji is selected and added at a random position of the image, and this is based on a sentiment analysis done by an AI component that looks at the conversation. We have a sentiment analysis algorithm that looks at the conversation and assigns a value of positive, neutral, negative, and then this value is used to determine which type of emoji is added to the image. This will get distorted as the image is created, but I thought it was an interesting way to have some input to the emotion of an image in this abstract way. Emojis are an interesting visual object to me as well. As well as this, there's colors that are picked. So there's color blocks here that are created from an averaging of everything that the camera in the machine is seeing. The idea of this is that it is creating a unique color every time that a different person is standing in front of it. It might be influenced by the clothing that a person is wearing or the time of day or these kind of things. So those are added as 2 blocks and randomly arranged onto this starting point image as well. As well as that, there's 2 snippets, like 2 crops of the camera. So they're pretty close crops because I didn't want to be making things that are too identifiable for people. So I don't want it to become like a surveillance thing of people having their face photographed. So these are pretty close crops that are then arranged randomly onto the scene as well and will also be distorted. So if this is the seed image and then the poem is generated with the person and then it comes out as something like this. As you can see, it's kind of resembling the seed image that we started with experimentation of the amount of iterations of steps through the diffusion model that it is given will transform in a certain amount or leave a certain amount of the starting point image visible and recognizable. But it always does get pretty transformed, and I think it creates an interesting aesthetic, and it's interesting to me what it changes, what it leaves, and kind of where it takes these kind of images. And here we have a whole collection of images that are made by the machine. This is from the first collection of outputs that we've downloaded from the machine. So it's been in the public space for 2 or 3 months now, and we've had about 5,000 interactions. So there's been almost 5,000 images generated by users collaborating with the machine in public space. It's kind of interesting to me how much the same they all look, and then that is obviously a part of the settings that we have on the stable diffusion model, which I kind of like, that there's a certain amount of influence that a person can have, but it's very much a collaboration with the machine. So you can see the machine's biases and the input images are very recognizable still in the final artwork that's created. So that's a bit about what the machine literally does and how we built it. What's interesting to me as well is how it operates in public space and what it creates a space for and an opportunity for. I think it's interesting and kind of important to give people, general public, the opportunity to engage and interact with these AI tools in a clear and transparent way in public space. These are things that are going to become more and more prevalent and everywhere, but I think it is nice to give people a space where they can see what these things are capable of in public and be able to engage or encounter these things without having to be deep in research or art or a techie kind of person. I think that's something that is nice about public art, is to give people that opportunity. Another interesting thing that emerged from making this artwork, and that I hadn't really thought about much before making it, but have had a few people talk to me about since it's been in the space, is the idea of interacting with these screens in a public setting and the way that you talk to a machine like this, or what the expectation is when you're talking to something or when you're using a device, or even if it's a search engine or social media or an AI like ChatGPT kind of model, when normally the default assumption for these things is that it is a private one-on-one interaction. But once you take these things away and put it in public space, it becomes a more obvious performance, or it becomes very self-conscious, the interaction that people have with these things. People kind of don't really know what to say, or you become a little bit nervous. I think it's a really revealing kind of process to go through, to think about your interactions with screens as a public thing. I think a big idea around all of this social media and search engine and basically online behavior is that it feels private. It feels like it's a thing that only we're doing, but by the nature of what the internet is and how these businesses work, it's not really. It feels private, but it's not. It's being observed, it's being catalogued, it's being documented, your behavior. Even if an actual person isn't walking past you, looking at you doing it, there is an element of public performance to these things, whether we realize it or not. And I think it was interesting to kind of embody that in this artwork. So for me, experimenting with all of these different processes and tools, I find that is a really useful way for me to figure out how these things work and to learn about them by doing and by exploring and experimenting, and then figure out how I think and how I feel about these things in that way. And I hope that that is something that we can do with this machine as well. In its ideal state, I think it would be a person creating a new artwork in collaboration with the machine, and then through that process understanding something about how it works, how these things are made, and get a deeper understanding of this image generation and language generation and how these things work and what it feels like and what it is that they're doing. So all of this comes down to AI literacy, and in general, I think AI literacy is going to be a very important thing and something that I am starting to think about a bit, and I think will become more and more important as these tools become more and more implemented and used everywhere in art, and then in like journalism and advertising, and everywhere that images are used and have uses. Something that I think about in relation to this and is useful is Marshall McLuhan's idea of the horseless carriage. The idea that we will view new media through the lens of and in relation to media that comes before it. So that we're thinking about these things as a kind of a one-for-one replacement of ways of creating images that have come before, whether it's photography or painting or whatever. What generally does happen with the advent of new media is that it creates something different, and these things are implemented in new and different ways instead of a just one-for-one replacement. And a way to think about that, and I think a funny and interesting thing to look at, is the way that AI image generation at the moment is treating these previous media. So another idea of Marshall McLuhan that is kind of related to this is that the content of a new medium is the medium that comes before it. So when film is introduced, the content that is first put to film is theatre. The first recorded music was a recording of live performance of music. And we can see where these media have matured, have become more and more distanced from the previous media that came before it. So music is so much more complex now than a live recording, or film is so much more complex than a live theatre performance. It's interesting to kind of compare AI image generation to photography or painting or previous types of image alteration. I've asked, in part of my conversation for this, I asked ChatGPT to create some examples of this sort of medium specificity and this weird medium crossover. So we've got here a serene landscape at sunsets captured through a wide-angle lens with a small aperture. A close-up portrait of a woman in a red dress taken with a telephoto lens and a large aperture. A bustling city street at night shot with a fisheye lens and a medium aperture. It's interesting to me, like, what the inherent properties of this media and how much of it is coming from previous things and how much of it is new, and how these things treated by the new processes and what does that do to the images. I think it's important to remember in the discussion around this transition from traditional image media to AI generation that this kind of falsification and discussion around deep fakes and like fake news and these kind of things, that image falsification isn't a new thing, and it's something that has always happened and happens with every new advance of technology and has happened since photography. And it's just about being aware of these things. I've got a few examples of some other things that I asked ChatGPT to create, also making images that reveal or imitate the quirks of previous media making processes, which I thought were kind of funny. I think the biggest thing for me as an artist and as a consumer of images in general is to think about what an image is doing and what is the objective of what it is trying to do, what is it actually doing, and how is this mediation impacting this, whether this is journalism or photojournalistic imagery, which is just to convey information or to tell a story, or advertising where it's trying to convince you to take an action, usually buying things, or where it has a range of different objectives and trying to understand what that is in the context of the image and how that impacts your interpretation of it and has impacted the creation process of the image. I think a lot of the time imagery can be used and tries to tell truth about things, or the goal, I think, of a lot of images that are made is to convey some sort of truth or arrive at a truth about something, whether this is creating art or paintings or taking photos or photojournalism or any of these kind of things. Someone interesting that I came across was the photography of Frank Hurley, who's an Australian war photographer and created these images. They're listed as composite negatives. I hadn't come across these before. It was interesting to me as a really early example of image manipulation and falsification, and I think it's interesting to think about if this image is telling a truth or not, whether it is real or if it is made up. There's a whole discussion around photography and the eye of the artist and what you're including and what you're excluding, but I thought these were interesting images to include as old examples of this kind of thing. Another funny or scary one that came across my social media feeds was this example of the New Zealand National Party using a Mid-Journey created image of some Maori nurses as part of a political campaign, which I think becomes a tricky thing about what is it that a political party should be representing, or what is the information that you're trying to communicate if you're trying to talk to real people about real people, but you're using a falsely generated image of people that don't actually exist. I think it gets complicated and a bit messy. As you can see in the image itself, it is quite convincing, and if you aren't someone that is very familiar with Mid-Journey, you wouldn't be able to detect this right away, and it would probably just slide by and you wouldn't pick up on it as something out of place. So like with this example of the New Zealand political party, the only way of becoming really media literate with this new type of image making is through basically just exposing yourself and becoming more and more aware of what things are capable of and what things look like. It's difficult to teach, but it's just about being immersed in this new media environment and becoming aware of what there is and being able to pick up on these kind of clues, which is something that is impossible to teach really, and is going to be a constant and ongoing process. Something that was really interesting to me thinking about this transition from photography to AI image generation is I feel like there is a fundamental difference between editing photography or like having manipulated photography as compared to completely freshly generated photography, and what it is that this means and the inherent understanding of what an image is for general people. We grow up in a photographically image-rich environment, and through an inherent understanding of what the medium of photography is and what it does and how it works, we have this understanding and I guess belief and comprehension that a photographic looking image brings with it and implies the existence at some point in time and space of a person holding a device that created this image, and then a subject that was doing a thing, performing an act, being in a physical time and space that created this image. I think the implication of AI image generation bringing into doubt that there is a seed and a starting point of this kind of real time and space existence of the subjects of these images, I think that creates something new, or that brings a bit of destabilization to what it means to have a photographic image. Thinking about the way that I want to use these tools to make images, and thinking about people and artists that I like using tools, whether it is new AI image generation tools or previous image manipulation tools like Photoshop or video editing or whatever. Maybe think about these different tiers and types of images that are made this way. I'm sure this isn't exhaustive, but I've kind of been thinking about things in 4 different categories of image manipulation, whether this is an experimental or an exploratory way of using these tools where it's clear in the image that you're using the tool, and an average viewer can see that this was a starting point, there was an image and it has been altered in some way. This kind of alteration is the purpose of this new object that has been created, and then that says something about what it is. Like the artwork is about the image manipulation. A lot of the work of Soda Jerk, who do a lot of video work, who I really like, their work is a lot about this. They do a lot of video collage and rotoscoping and editing together. Similar thing with Nam June Paik, who a lot of people will probably know, a very early example of media manipulation artist with this, again, moving image, but manipulating the media and the ways that we receive these images, and manipulating them and altering them in a really obvious and clear way, and using that as a way to bring into question the materiality of these images. After the experimental, I would think that there's something about using these tools in a really seamless way to create an illusion, but in a way that provokes wonder and awe. You look at this kind of image, or you watch Avatar, and you're aware that these things aren't real, but the way that the tools are used and implemented is so convincing and beautiful and awe-inspiring that it becomes an immersive and convincing experience and creates a different experience for a viewer. And then similarly, this like really early use of like really highly technical Photoshop, these kinds of images that were around and still are around, people at the peak of the craft using them to make images that are clearly photoshopped or clearly altered and clearly representing something like surreal. But that's also what the image is about this flawless implementation of the toolkit. I think another use for this kind of image alteration is for jokes or memes, about making funny things or just like using it in ways where it is clear that the image is altered, and that is the purpose of the image as well, and that is what the sting of it comes from. The final category of image that I've been thinking about is similar to the seamless wonder, I think, but it is a more subtle and more deceptive or tricking use of this image manipulation technology, whether it is for movies where you're creating a realistic environment or a realistic image, but you're using these kind of tools to do that in a way that is seamless and undetectable. And then a similar thing happens with social media imagery, which is a funny example, but is also something to be aware of. And a similar thing happens with advertising, etc., etc. So I think it's useful to think about how image manipulation and AI image generation is used, and which of these categories an image is trying to fit into, I guess, and how it works and what it does. Like, what is the end result of what an image is doing and how it is being implemented and what it is saying. I've been talking a lot about images in this, and as a painter and a visual artist, I think that's the main thing that I think about. But obviously a lot of AI is based on text generation and natural language models and voice simulation, and all of these things are a whole other topic to tackle, and I think maybe will have even a greater impact than image generation because we've had image manipulation for so long. I think the easy and fast generation of natural language and natural spoken language is going to be so much more impactful because it is not something that people have generally had exposure to, or we haven't had time to adjust to in the past, really. Something interesting that people ask about in relation to this with the vending machine project is a lot of people have asked, oh, so have you got a bunch of pre-written responses to what people say, is kind of the initial thing that people think, trying to figure out how it works, which I think this shows a kind of video game logic application to these new technologies, where you're trying to understand this new thing that you're seeing in the context of what people know. And a lot of people think about interacting with a computer through a video game where you have decision trees and branches and things are generated in that way and responses are created and prompted through this, whereas this new way of making is completely generative and it's making something different every time in a completely different and new way to how text and conversation and chatbots might have happened and worked in the past. There's something in here as well about another idea that I have come across recently from Lev Manovich in his book, The Language of New Media. He talks about the idea that traditional photographs point to past events while synthetic photographs point to future events. And this idea that photography, by its nature, is referencing a time and place in the past. And this new kind of synthetic image generation gives the opportunity to visualize and create and conjure something new in the future, which I think may have some application to this, but I'm still not entirely convinced of the idea that AI can generate things that are truly new. I think a lot of AI is, by its nature, creating a repetition and a recreation of things in the past by the very nature of it being trained on imagery from the past. Having said that, I'll run through some example of how I've been using AI in my work more recently, even more recently than the ATM project. Yeah, this is from a project that I have been working on in the last few weeks. So this is for a music video that I'm working on, and I think this is an interesting potential use for AI imagery and something interesting to think about. I had an idea for a video shoot with an artist that I'm working with and needed to create references and be able to convey this idea for what I wanted to make to the musician's management to get it approved and be able to make the work. Ordinarily, this would be done by finding reference imagery from a lot of previously existing works and videos and media and having to collage this into a mood board of what this new thing will look like to get people to get on board with it and be okay with making a new thing. But rather than doing that, I went on to DALL-E, and it took me 2 minutes and a little bit of fiddling, but managed to create images of the kind of vibe and mood of what it is that I was planning to make. I'm unsure about how I feel about the idea of AI being able to be truly creative and on its own and make something truly new, but I can see that there will be applications to this kind of media and to this kind of making process that will be accelerated and sped up in a huge way. I feel like this kind of process of idea generation and making has applications to certain types of processes like music videos or filmmaking, where it is something that ordinarily you need to get a huge amount of people on board and to see your vision. It's collaborating with a lot of people to execute a cohesive vision, more so than just a singular artist pouring out an idea from their head into creating something. And I think this is a useful tool for that specifically. So these are some of the AI generated images, and here are some early still screenshots from the video of what we ended up actually making, which I think is interesting how close they were. So overall, I feel like these new tools of image generation and AI, generative language models, etc., are going to have a huge impact on image-based media and the generation of writing text, automated speech, and so on. And I think it's very important for people to be aware of what these changes might be and to be literate and to be able to apply critical thinking and critical evaluation to these things as they become more and more enmeshed in our everyday life. Yeah, thank you for listening. I feel like this was a very loose ramble and kind of touching on a whole heap of different ideas, which I'm very excited to discuss and talk through and answer any questions about. Thanks.